A mother's desperate prayer was lost in the Maine fog, a silent plea swallowed by the sigh of the pines and the cold Atlantic spray. 3 small children vanished, snatched from a rocky shore and hidden in the belly of a windowless van, their whispered song a fragile shield against the growing dark. The only ones on their trail. A heartbroken mother with nothing left to lose and a dog who had once failed his most important test. When they reached the abandoned cannery on the edge of the forgotten cove, what they discovered didn't just mend a family. It healed a town's oldest wounds. This story will test your nerves, challenge your doubt, and prove that the quietest heroes are often the ones who have been broken. And if you believe that no child should be stolen, no mother left to weep in the fog, and no dog is ever truly a failure, then hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the saviors we pray for have fur, walk on 4 paws, and never, ever give up. The town of Port Blossom clung to the rocky coast of Maine like a stubborn barnacle, a place where the scent of salt and pine were woven into the very fabric of the air. It was early October, and a thick, damp fog rolled in from the sea, blurring the lines between the gray water and the gray sky. The silence was heavy, broken only by the mournful call of a distant foghorn and the secret rustle of things unseen. Clara Vance stood on the windswept bluff behind her small cottage, a paintbrush held loosely in her hand, a smudge of cerulean blue on her cheek. At 34, Clara had the soul of an artist, with gentle hands and eyes that saw the world in shades of light and color. But beneath the surface was a core of resilience, forged in the wake of losing her husband to the unforgiving sea 2 years prior. She'd moved to Port Blossom for the quiet, to raise her children away from the noise, surrounded by the raw beauty that both healed and haunted her. Her cottage, a salt-bleached cedar shake, sat on a cliff overlooking a small, private cove. That afternoon, her children, Leo, Finn, and Nora, were exploring the tide pools below, their laughter echoing off the wet rocks. At 8, Leo was the self-appointed guardian, his pockets always full of interesting stones. Finn, 6, was the quiet observer, his eyes missing nothing. And 5-year-old Nora was pure joy, her bright yellow raincoat a spot of sunshine in the gloom. The last time Clara glanced down, they were building a fortress of driftwood. But now the cove was still. "Kids," Clara called, her voice thin against the vastness. The fog seemed to muffle the sound. No answer. "Leo, Finn, Nora," she shouted, a thread of panic weaving into her tone. She set her easel aside and scrambled down the worn path to the shore. The driftwood fortress stood half-finished. The bucket and shovels were abandoned. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. Then came a low, anxious whine. Bear, their 3-year-old Newfoundland, lumbered out from behind a large boulder. His massive, black-furred frame was built for the water, but he moved with a strange hesitation. A large tear in his left ear was a permanent reminder of the day he'd washed out of his water rescue certification. Too gentle, the trainer had said, not aggressive enough in a crisis. Clara had adopted him from the rescue a week later, seeing a kindred spirit in his sad, intelligent eyes. Now Bear was anything but gentle. His tail was stiff, his head low, and a deep growl rumbled in his chest. He nosed at the damp sand near the path leading up to the road. "What is it, boy?" Clara whispered, her heart hammering. Bear let out a sharp bark and trotted up the path. The fog was thinner here. She saw them immediately, tire tracks wide and deep, cutting into the soft shoulder of the gravel lane. They hadn't been there this morning. That's when her world tilted. She screamed their names, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. As she reached the road, her eyes caught on something small and pearlescent lying in the mud. A single, perfect scallop shell, worn smooth by the ocean. Finn's favorite. He never went anywhere without it. Clara fell to her knees, the shell digging into her palm. The foghorn cried out again, a lonely, desolate sound. A quarter-mile down the coast, in a small, meticulously kept cabin, Silas Croft was mending a fishing net, his gnarled fingers working the twine with practiced ease. At 68, Silas was carved from the same granite as the coastline, weathered, solitary, and unyielding. His face was a roadmap of sun and sea, his white beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the sharp, distant focus of a man who'd spent 40 years as a Coast Guard captain. He'd retired to Port Blossom to be alone with his ghosts, his gruff demeanor a wall built to keep the world out. But the sound that carried on the wind wasn't the usual cry of a gull. It was human. It was pain. Silas set his net down and stepped onto his porch. Through the swirling fog, he saw the faint outline of Clara Vance, collapsed on the side of the road. He started walking. When he reached her, she was trying to dial 911, her hands shaking too badly to work the screen. "No signal out here," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Fog's too thick." Clara looked up, her face a mask of anguish. "They're gone, Silas. My children. They took my children." He didn't ask questions. He looked at the tracks, at Bear pacing restlessly, at the shell clutched in her hand. "A van," he stated, not asked, his eyes scanning the impression. "Heavy. Heading north, away from the highway." "What do we do?" she choked out. Silas looked at the darkening sky. The tide was turning. "We go. The sheriff will take an hour to get here from the mainland, and they'll get lost in this fog. You and we're not waiting." He strode back toward his cabin. "Get in my truck. We have charts. We have a radio. And we have him." He nodded toward Bear, who was already facing north, as if he could see the road no one else could. Inside Silas's cabin, the walls were covered not with pictures, but with nautical charts, weather maps, and tide tables. He spread a chart of the county's coastline on his table. "If they're avoiding the main road, they'll take the old logging trail toward Carver's Point." "Can we catch them?" Clara asked, her voice hollow. He met her gaze, a flicker of something ancient and determined in his eyes. "Ma'am, with that dog's nose and my knowledge of these backwaters, we're the only chance they've got." Outside, the fog thickened, and the world seemed to shrink to just the road ahead. Clara held Finn's shell so tightly it hurt, her fear and hope warring within her. The panel van rattled along the old logging trail, its sides scraping against overgrown pine branches. Inside, in the pitch-black cargo space, 3 small children huddled together on a dusty blanket that smelled of oil and damp earth. Leo had his arms around his brother and sister. "It's okay," he whispered, his own voice trembling. "Dad taught us the signal. Remember?" Their hands were loosely bound with zip ties, their ankles with a single length of rope. The work of amateurs in a hurry. They weren't gagged. A small, rust-eaten hole in the floor near the wheel well let in a sliver of gray light. Finn, the quiet one, pressed his face to the cold metal. He started to hum. A simple, 3-note tune their father, a musician, had made up for them. "Home, home, safe." Nora joined in, her tiny voice a fragile echo. Leo added his, a low harmony. It was a sound too small to be heard over the engine, but to them it was a shield. Finn then pulled a small, smooth stone from his pocket, his backup treasure, and pushed it through the rusty hole in the floor. It fell silently onto the muddy track below. Back at the Port Blossom ferry and bait shop, Marco, 19, was scrolling through his phone, bored. The ferry to the outer islands had been cancelled due to the fog, and business was dead. Marco had a reputation for being lazy, a kid waiting for summer to end so he could escape his small town. But he noticed things. The van that pulled up to the empty dock was wrong. A dented, windowless Ford Econoline, mud caked up to where the windows should be. Parked away from the lights, engine running. 2 men got out. One was burly, with a shaved head and a tattoo of a snarling wolf on his neck. The other was thin and twitchy, constantly looking over his shoulder. They weren't buying bait. Marco watched as they opened the back of the van. For just a second, a flicker of yellow. A child's raincoat. Marco's blood ran cold. He ducked behind the counter, phone already in his hand. 1 bar. He snapped a quick, blurry photo of the van and its license plate. He texted it to the county sheriff's dispatch with 1 word. "Kids." The text failed to send. Cursing, he scribbled the plate number on a napkin. "Blue van, 499, G8R. 2 men." headed Carver's Point. As the van sped off, Marco ran to the old landline behind the counter, the one that only worked half the time, and prayed. It rang. "Got something?" Silas said, holding his crackling radio. A dispatcher's voice, broken by static. "Ferry and bait. Suspicious vehicle. Plate matches possible children. Carver's Point." Clara gripped the dashboard. In the back, Bear stood up, his massive head pressed against the rear window, his low whine a promise of pursuit. The rain began to fall, slicking the road. Silas pointed to a narrow, unmarked path on the chart. "That's an old smuggler's run. It cuts straight across the peninsula. It'll be hell on the truck, but it'll put us ahead of them before they reach the cove." "Are you sure?" Clara asked. He looked at her, the steel in his eyes finally softening for a moment. "I spent a decade chasing drug runners through these same coves. I'm sure." Clara didn't hesitate. She looked at the treacherous path ahead. "Then drive." In the back of the rattling van, the children started to sing their father's tune, a little louder this time, a song of hope in the darkness. And somewhere behind them, moving through the fog-drenched pines, a huge, black dog had caught their scent on the wind. The fog clung to the coast like a shroud as Silas's truck bucked and slid down the muddy smuggler's trail. The ancient pines closed in around them, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. Ahead, the world was a wall of gray. Bear, riding in the truck bed under a tarp, was a silent, brooding presence, his focus absolute. Clara could see the muscles in his haunches tense with every bump, his injured ear twitching at sounds only he could hear. They were heading for an abandoned fish cannery at the mouth of a secluded cove, a place marked on Silas's chart with a single, ominous X. The fragmented radio call from Marco had been their lodestar, confirming Silas's grim prediction. "They're cornering themselves," he'd muttered. "Only one road in or out of that cove. They're planning to wait for a boat." "This is it," Silas said, killing the engine about a half-mile from the cove. He got out, pulling a worn canvas duffel bag from behind his seat. He wore a dark watch cap pulled low over his weathered face, and his old Coast Guard jacket seemed to blend into the gloom. Clara slid out after him, her sneakers sinking into the wet earth. The air was thick with the smell of brine and decay. Her heart pounded a painful, frantic rhythm against her ribs. "We have to go now." "No," Silas commanded, his voice sharp but low. "We go smart. They'll be watching the road. We go through the trees. Stay behind me, and keep him quiet." He gestured to Bear. Clara knelt and put a hand on Bear's massive head. The dog looked at her, his deep brown eyes filled with an intelligence that went beyond training. He didn't whine or bark. He simply understood. They moved through the woods like ghosts, the thick carpet of pine needles silencing their steps. Soon, the cannery emerged from the fog, a hulking, rusted skeleton of corrugated tin and broken windows. A single blue van was parked near a crumbling loading dock. Through a grimy window in the van's rear door, Clara saw it. A small handprint. Nora's. She choked back a sob. "Wait here," Silas ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew how to use cover, slipping from one ancient tree to another until he was behind a stack of rotting lobster traps near the van. He pulled a small, powerful monocular from his pocket and scanned the area. Just then, a side door of the cannery creaked open. A big man with a shaved head stepped out, the one Marco had described. He lit a cigarette, his eyes lazily scanning the woods. "That's Benny the Wolf Gallo," Silas breathed into his small handheld radio, his voice a ghost in Clara's earpiece. "Local muscle. Works for smugglers up the coast. Low-level trash." Benny tossed his cigarette and turned to go back inside. As he did, he yanked someone out of the van. It was Leo. His face was pale, his jaw set in a mask of terrified defiance, but he didn't make a sound. Benny shoved him toward the cannery. "Quit looking for a way out, kid. There ain't one." Clara saw red. She forgot Silas's order, forgot the plan. She burst from the trees. "Let him go." Benny spun around, his hand reaching for a pistol tucked into his jeans. But he was too slow. Bear erupted from the shadows, a silent, black cannonball of fur and fury. The dog that was too gentle hit Benny square in the chest, the impact sending the big man sprawling backward with a strangled cry. The gun skittered across the wet gravel. Leo screamed his mother's name. Clara ran to him, scooping him into her arms. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." But as she turned, the cannery door flew open again. The second man, thin, wiry, with frightened, darting eyes, lunged at her. He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. "You just made a big mistake," he hissed. Before Clara could react, something hard struck the side of her head. The world exploded in a flash of white, then swam in a dizzying haze. Leo was torn from her grasp. His cries mixed with Nora's screams from inside the van. Bear, standing over the downed man, was caught. He pivoted, a low growl tearing from his throat, but the wiry man was already dragging Clara toward the cannery. Benny was on his feet now, clutching his arm where Bear's teeth had left their mark. "Get them inside," he roared. "Tie them up." When Clara's vision cleared, she was on the cold, damp floor of the cannery, her hands tied. Next to her, Finn was crying silently, his small body shaking. Bear was gone. From a ridge overlooking the cove, Silas lowered his monocular. It had all happened too fast. He'd seen Bear's attack, seen Clara get grabbed, and he'd seen Bear, smart and brave, slip under the loading dock and disappear into the shadows. He pulled out his radio, keying the mic for the sheriff's channel. "Dispatch, this is Croft. Hostage situation at the old Carver cannery. I need backup now. Shots may be fired." He received only static in reply. The fog was too thick. They were alone. Crouched in the dying light, Silas thought of his own daughter, lost not to kidnappers, but to a storm at sea 20 years ago. A rescue he'd arrived at minutes too late. "Not again," he whispered to the fog. "Not this time." The wind shifted, carrying a faint, three-note melody from inside the cannery. A child's song. A beacon. Silas chambered a round in his old hunting rifle. He wasn't waiting for a clear signal. The air inside the cannery was cold and smelled of rust and dead things. Evelyn lay on the concrete floor, her head throbbing. Her hands were bound in front of her with thick rope. Beside her, Finn trembled, his small face buried in her side. Leo and Nora were on the other side of the room, near the wiry man who was anxiously pacing by the door. Benny was nursing his bleeding arm, cursing. They were trapped. The fog outside had turned the world into a gray, featureless void. Hope felt like a distant memory. Then she heard it, faintly at first coming from Leo. A soft, rhythmic tapping against a metal barrel. Tap, 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 tap. It was the rhythm of their song, the one his father had taught them. Home, home, safe. Nora heard it and joined in, humming the tune. It was a signal. It was a prayer. Outside, in the dense woods, Silas was moving. He'd circled around to the back of the building, using the sound of the surf to cover his steps. He paused, listening. Through the wind and waves, he heard it too. A rhythmic, metallic tapping. It wasn't random. It was a code. It was life. He remembered his own daughter teaching him a similar code when she was a girl. 3 taps for, "I love you." This was different, but the intent was the same. "We are here." He unslung his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a captain, and this was his ship to save. Then, a new sound. A low growl from the darkness beneath the loading dock. A massive, black shape emerged from the shadows. Bear. His fur was matted with mud, and he was favoring his front paw, but his eyes glowed with fierce purpose. He looked at Silas, and for a moment, the man and the dog shared a silent understanding. When Benny stepped outside to check the road, Bear moved. He didn't charge this time. He was a shadow, slipping behind the man and sinking his teeth into the back of his knee. Benny screamed and went down, his leg buckling. The sound sent the wiry man inside into a panic. He ran to the door, weapon raised. That was Clara's chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she kicked out, knocking a stack of empty crates onto him. He stumbled, giving her the second she needed. She scrambled to her feet, pulling Finn with her. Leo, Nora, now! The wiry man recovered and aimed his pistol, but a shot rang out from the woods. Not at him, but at the metal roof above him. The ricochet screamed through the air. Drop it! Silas's voice boomed, amplified by the fog. This is the Coast Guard. You are surrounded. It was a lie, but a damn good one. The man froze, then dropped his gun and bolted out the back door, disappearing into the fog. Benny was on the ground, whimpering, with Bear standing over him, a silent, furry warden. Silas emerged from the trees, rifle held ready. Clara didn't wait. She ran to Leo and Nora, pulling all three of her children into a desperate, sobbing embrace. You're okay. You're all okay. Leo looked past her, his eyes wide with awe. Bear saved us, he whispered. Clara turned. The massive dog limped toward them, finally letting out a soft whine. He nudged her hand, then leaned his heavy head against her, his duty done. They huddled together as the wail of a distant siren finally cut through the fog. Silas knelt beside Bear, gently examining his paw. You're no failure, old boy, he murmured, stroking the dog's torn ear. You were just waiting for the right fight. Dawn broke over Port Blossom, burning away the fog to reveal a world washed clean. The blue and red lights of the sheriff's cruisers still flashed silently in front of Clara's cottage, a reminder of the night's terror. But inside, there was only peace. Clara sat on her couch, a child tucked under each arm, all three fast asleep. Silas was in the kitchen, making coffee, moving with a quiet purpose that seemed to fill the small house with a sense of safety. Bear lay on the rug before the fireplace, his injured paw wrapped, his tail thumping softly every time one of the children stirred. Sheriff Thompson, a kind woman with tired eyes, had called him a hero. Marco, the kid from the bait shop, had been on the local news. The town, once just a collection of quiet neighbors, had become a community overnight. A few weeks later, a small, hand-carved sign appeared at the end of Clara's driveway, hammered into the ground by Silas. The letters were rough, but the message was clear. Bear's Cove. Trespassers will be licked. Silas had started spending most of his afternoons at the cottage, teaching the children how to tie sailors' knots and read the stars. He was still a man of few words, but his eyes no longer held the same solitary distance. He had found a new crew, a new purpose, and Bear, the gentle giant who had failed his test, became the town's undisputed legend. He never regained the full strength in his paw, but it didn't matter. His heart was the strongest thing on the entire coast. Sometimes, the answers to our most desperate prayers don't come in a flash of lightning. They come on four paws, with a torn ear and a heart that knows what it means to be rescued. In a world that often feels lost in the fog, this story is a lighthouse, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. Love is a signal in the dark, and hope is a dog who will walk through hell to bring you home. So, if this story warmed your soul, share it with someone who needs a little light. If you've ever felt lost and waited for a sign, maybe this is it. Leave a comment below and tell us about the bear in your life. Subscribe for more stories that prove goodness still wins. And above all, may God bless you, yes, you, for believing in the quiet heroes. Because the bravest souls don't always wear a badge or a uniform. Sometimes they just wear a collar and walk beside us, proof that we are never truly alone. Type Amen if you believe in second chances.